Arkansans Ask Governor Asa Hutchinson is underwritten by the Arkansas State Employees Association Incorporated, an organization of state employees working toward the betterment of state government.
And a very pleasant good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Arkansans Ask. I'm Rex Nelson of the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. I'll be your host tonight, and our guest is Governor Asa Hutchinson. Governor, great to have you join us.
It's great to be with you, Rex.
And we've got our fine folks from the Arkansas State Employees Association here again, so we would love to have your questions during the course of the evening. 1-800-662-2386. That's 1-800-662-2386. Or you can email us at paffairs@aetn.org. That's paffairs@aetn.org. And we'll get as many of your questions as we possibly can to Governor Hutchinson. You just came from the Christmas tree lighting ceremony in downtown Little Rock, I understand.
You know, I did. It was really special. It's the first time that they've done this. A very large tree, 45-foot fir tree, beautiful lights on it. And so Santa and I were there and pulled the switch along with Keegan, a young boy that from Children's Hospital.
Oh, great.
Big heart, and it was fun to be there and start. I remind everybody we're really giving Thanksgiving for Christmas.
Absolutely.
We're not to Thanksgiving yet.
Absolutely. Well, it is Thanksgiving week, my favorite holiday, because it's all about family, food, and football. And I like those three things, as I know you do too also, Governor.
I'm looking forward to Thanksgiving.
Let's get down to business. You have been quite the world traveler in your years as governor. You had a recent trip to China again. What came out of that trip? Anything good for Arkansas?
Indeed. This was my third trip to China and Japan as governor, and each time it bears more fruit. We have got 5 companies that have invested in Arkansas as a result of those trips, some of them very large investment, creating jobs. In this trip, we wanted to make sure that we maintained the relationship and kept these projects on target. As you know, having roots down in Arkadelphia.
That's my hometown.
That Sun Paper Company, investing their $1 billion in a bioproducts paper mill, utilizing our timber resources. We met with Sun Paper, want to make sure that's on target. With the Rui Garment Company in Forest City, met with them. But also in terms of a new project, we went to Hefei, China, where Ricever makes steel for counterweights in large excavation equipment. They're coming to Jonesboro, a $20 million investment. I think it's 100 and some jobs. And so we signed the memorandum of understanding with them, an incredible facility, welcoming ceremony, and they played God Bless America when I landed.
Oh, wow. Well, you touched on my next question, because we have the pulp mill that has been announced for Arkadelphia, which will benefit all of South Arkansas, because at capacity, I understand it'll use about 400 truckloads of pulp at a time. And then we've got the mill for Forest City, which will basically use all of the cotton being grown in Arkansas at this time. Those are 2 areas of our state, South Arkansas and East Arkansas, that need some help. So you are confident that both of those projects are going forward?
Absolutely. I am. You know, and we're doing everything we can to make sure they stay on target. Sun Paper just needs one more permit, getting the engineering work in, because it's a very, very large project. Rui has already had a hiring fair there. Had 1,100 people show up for the jobs there in Forest City, and so they're on target as well. And I did have a goal as governor to create jobs across this state. South and East Arkansas, the Delta was a focus of mine, so I was really elated with the announcement of those 2 projects, particularly whenever you see those jobs coming to Forest City. It's going to utilize our great cotton.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the first of the Twitter questions that I was handed is, what is the state's plan to assist the Delta region in bringing back education, employment? And I could expand that past the Delta to South Arkansas, because, Governor, we do have a large number of counties that continue to lose population in the state right now. What can state government do?
Well, obviously it's the communities and the partnership we have with them. It's what every individual person does. But in terms of what we can do, recruitment of industry and encouraging a balanced economy. For example, in the Delta, we've really promoted Delta tourism as well. The Delta Heritage Trail, the investment in other areas. So the balanced economy in terms of agriculture, which will always be strong, manufacturing, trying to recruit industry to give young people a second reason to stay in their community and that opportunity. And then about the education is very, very important. And whenever we passed the mandate for computer science education, I thought about our rural communities because I went to school in a rural school. I want to make sure it was available to them. And so it's exciting when I go on my computer coding tour, I go to Helena, West Helena, Central High School there. You know, I will go to Star City, and I will go to Wynn. And these schools have very strong programs. Forest City, I was there, had I think over 100 students taking computer science. So it's our way of promoting a strong education program, and then to get a letter back from some of them to say, now I see an opportunity to stay in my community because I can use these skills here. One final thing is broadband access.
Right, absolutely.
And you can't, you know, you can run the world from any rural environment in Arkansas if you have access to high-speed internet. Now, we don't have it everywhere, but we have it in every school. Every school in Arkansas, rural or urban, has the highest speed of access to broadband that exceeds the federal standard. We plugged in the last one last year, so it's a great success story as making that available to our students all across the state.
Governor, let's move. We're talking about rural areas. Let's move from the Delta and South Arkansas up into the Ozarks. You knew this question was coming. The Buffalo River, our first national river, the Buffalo River watershed. I was at a speech that your predecessor as governor gave, and during the question and answer, former Governor Beebe was asked, what is your biggest regret in 8 years as governor? And he said, I wish we hadn't given a permit to that hog farm. Is it time that we admit as a state? Are we at the point where we say we made a mistake, we need to pay what's necessary to buy them out? Where are we on that issue?
Well, if there's ever any risk to the Buffalo River or there any scientific evidence that it's a problem, we will take whatever steps are necessary to protect it. I floated the buffalo this last year. It is, and I've done it throughout my life, it's one of our great treasures, not both in the state but nationally. And so I am fully committed to make sure the Buffalo River is protected. We have the Buffalo River Coalition, which is the group of my agency directors that look at how we can take affirmative steps to better protect the Buffalo River. In reference to the farm, there was a question came up as to whether there was any seepage.
Yep.
I ordered additional testing to be done. It came back negative. And so right now their renewal of their permit, I believe, is still pending. But I'm delighted that we were able to continue the moratorium in the Buffalo River watershed of any of those CAFOs, which is those large animal containment facilities. And so even though that was granted, that permit, there's not going to be any others that's going to be granted in that Buffalo River watershed.
And with what has already been granted, I want to be clear, you are confident that there is no damage to the Buffalo River watershed being done at this time. Is that correct?
Correct. We have most recently tested it. We have regular testing of it. Not only the independent testers from the Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality, but you have the University of Arkansas researchers that are continuing to monitor that. And so if there's ever any sign that there's any leakage or at risk, then we have to take action to preserve it.
I mentioned your predecessor. One thing that he did not have to deal with in his 8 years were executions. Of course, his predecessor, Governor Huckabee, did a number of executions. Now there have been executions on your watch. We're getting questions about them. I know no matter where you stand on the death penalty, for or against the death penalty, that is really one of the worst nights for any governor, isn't it?
It is very, very difficult. You know, the weight of responsibilities is on your shoulders. You know you have to carry out the penalty that's been provided by law and a jury. But at the same time, you look at it very carefully to make sure there's not any issue of innocence or guilt, that there is guilt that's clearly established and found. And then, you know, you just want to do the right thing. So it's a responsibility you have. You don't ask for it. You don't rejoice in it, but you carry it out because that's part of the responsibilities of being governor.
And do you see things going forward? I know there are all kinds of questions out there now about the drugs, lawsuits where you obtain the drugs. Do you see things going forward with more executions on your watch as governor?
I do. And the reason is that they've been backed up for 20 years. And during the last 8 years before I became governor, there were 0 executions. And so when that happens, they just build up. And so they're processed through the courts. They reach a point where all the litigation stops and it goes to the Attorney General, and they send the names to me as governor to sign the death warrant. And so I see that because there is still that backlog that's continuing. Now, in terms of the question as to the availability of drugs and that issue, you know, we have a supply. We have available drugs that are on hand now for the near-term future. It all depends upon the continued availability of supply that other states are facing as well, South Carolina, other southern states. And so there actually needs to be a regional or a national solution to this. Each individual state right now is vested with its own responsibility to carry out the process. We've passed a law that gave protection for our supplier. We might have to amend that to make sure it's clear that the supply chain totally will be protected so that we can have access to those as we need it.
You have a long history in law enforcement in the legal system. You were the youngest U.S. attorney in the country at one point. You were a top official in the Department of Homeland Security. Based on your decades of experience, do you believe the death penalty is a deterrent? Does it work?
I think it's a general deterrent. And what I mean by that is when society sees the ultimate penalty carried out for the most vicious of crimes, that is a general deterrent for people entering that life of crime and violence. It's hard to point to definitive evidence that it's a specific deterrent. But punishment, as you know, is more than that. To me, it's justice. It is carrying out the sentence of a jury and satisfying the needs of society whenever the most heinous criminal act and murder is carried out. And so I see that it's supported by the vast majority of Arkansans, and it's our law, and so we'll continue that.
Gotcha. I'm going to ask you a political question before we get on to other questions. I was thinking as I drove over for the show tonight that you and I have known each other through politics for more than 30 years. One of us is getting old, it's probably me, but more than 30 years. You were very active in Republican politics in this state when you could basically count the Republicans on my two hands in the state. We have a Republican president now, and it's been quite a roller coaster ride for the last 10 months. Are you still supportive of the Trump administration? Do you think the president's doing a good job, or do you find him embarrassing as a Republican?
No, I think he's accomplishing a great deal, actually. Whenever you look at what he's done in terms of turning back federal regulations is hugely significant. Just in Arkansas, whether you're talking about waters of the U.S., whether you're talking about the burdensome Clean Air Act and how they have overly put in federal regulations that guide us here in Arkansas. They've taken away the state prerogative and the state partnership. So he's rolled back regulations. He's given us a good Supreme Court justice in Neil Gorsuch. Whenever you look at all the other judges he's appointed, whenever you look at how he's actually handled a number of issues on foreign affairs, and I think he's staked out some good territory for us. Not a complete stamp of approval. You know, he has a different style than I do. I would handle it totally different. I wonder about it, but that's who the people of Arkansas and the United States elected, and they elected him partly because of that style. So we've got it. But in terms of substance, as to how he's doing, I separate his actions and his substance from the rhetoric.
Your own reelection campaign aside, are you worried about Republicans at the national level losing the House and/or the Senate next year in the midterm elections?
Well, we've had some discussions among the governors about what happened in Virginia.
Yes.
And in Virginia and New Jersey, that was certainly a wake-up call in the sense that the Democrats were vastly outnumbered the Republicans in terms of the voting turnout. And so they had an increased turnout. In fact, Ed Gillespie had more votes than any other Republican in Virginia history. And so they met their vote goals. It's just the Democrats were intensified. They turned out in Northern Virginia. And so history says that the party out of power will not do well in the midterm elections, and that there's an intensity on the other side that we've seen in Virginia. So we're not going to take anything for granted. That's what elections are about. I've got a contract that's up for renewal next year,
exactly.
And we're going to make our case.
All right, got a question from up in Randolph County about concealed carry laws. Have we gone too far as a state, again, given your law enforcement background, with what we're allowing now in Arkansas, or have we struck about the right balance as far as our laws for carrying weapons?
Well, I'm a strong believer in the Second Amendment. It's our cherished right to bear arms, and we believe in it in Arkansas. We enforce that. We have both really an open carry law in Arkansas that's generally interpreted as open carry capability, but we also have a concealed carry law that allows for that with a permit.
Right.
I think it's shown to be very beneficial. Arkansans like it. They want that. I think we need to make it less burdensome to the extent that we can, so that it's never a burden to protect yourself. And then this last legislative session, we passed what we call enhanced carry, which really
my next question, yeah,
expanded Second Amendment rights again, so that it increased the venues in which you can carry a firearm in a concealed fashion to protect yourself, but it's going to require additional training. Is that the right balance? I think time will tell. So you always have to adjust things from time to time, but I think in the end, and it wasn't a pretty process, but in the end, I think we did strike a good balance.
I would think you and Charlie Collins have had some long discussions on this issue. He kind of carried the water on a lot of those bills.
He did. He carried it, and I thought his original bill went too far. I made some suggestions that we might modify it in this way. Ultimately, it got some momentum, and the end result was, you know, Charlie Collins, I think, really showed himself to be a solid legislator and a good team player that fought hard for the Second Amendment and expanding those rights, but did it in a very reasonable fashion. And, you know, what we learned on sports radio is that even the biggest redneck in Arkansas doesn't want to carry guns in Razorback Station.
Yeah, exactly.
Razorback Stadium.
Yeah. So overall, I'm going to expand that a little bit, talking about instead of one individual legislator, the entire legislature. Have you felt pretty good about your working relationship so far as governor with the 135 members of the legislature?
Oh, absolutely. They've been good team players. They've fought hard for their principles, but you look at the agenda that I ran on, and our first session, they passed my agenda. The second session, they passed my agenda. A lot of surprises came up along the way. There were disagreements, but in the end, what we've accomplished, from tax cuts to computer science programs to productivity funding model for higher education that really changes the whole format of funding higher education. What we've done in our reading initiatives and funding education, I think it's been a great partnership, and we've accomplished a lot.
Do you find yourself, though, having to be the pragmatist and even reeling some of the members of your own party back in a little bit? They always say there's a real difference between running for office and serving in office.
Well, sure, absolutely. It's easy for them sometimes to cast a vote saying, well, that'll be blocked in the Senate.
Yeah.
And then the Senate says, well, the governor will handle that. And so sometimes the buck just winds up on my desk, and I've got to make a tough call. And you know, sometimes there's disagreement. I vetoed some bills, but they've been sustained. Ones that I thought went too far, didn't have a good balance. And there are other instances that I drew their attention to it early on and they were able to remedy it. Sometimes they just win. You know, their will prevails.
You don't win them all.
And,
Yeah.
you know, and there's a natural friction, tension between the two branches of government. That's what our founding fathers designed. So I don't think we all have to every day put our arm around each other. It's just we have to realize we're working for the same goal. We're just coming at it from different approaches.
Well, just as we knew that open carry and concealed carry would come up, you knew medical marijuana was going to come up, right? This doesn't surprise you. From Prairie County, a question. Is that process moving along as quickly as you think it should right now, or do we need to speed up the process? I know it is. There are a million details to deal with right now.
Well, it's a humongous task that the Alcoholic Beverage Control Board's been assigned the responsibility.
And let me state, it's something you did not support, but the majority of Arkansans did, correct?
That's right. If people remember, I actually campaigned against it. But we lost. The people of Arkansas voted the medical marijuana in. And I said the ABC board, which is enforcement side of it, the Marijuana Commission will ultimately rule on the applications. There's over 300 applications that have to be sorted through on some very important issues. It's probably a little bit more difficult than anybody expected, but I think it is on target. And I expect in the first quarter of next year those licenses to be granted and ruled upon. Obviously not all of them will be, but they'll sort through, and the ones that are required can be issued. So I was, as soon as the voters passed it, I put some of my rainy day funds in order to jumpstart that effort so it would not be delayed. And I think it's been, everybody's been working together very hard, both to get it done, but also to keep the focus that this is not recreational use of marijuana.
Exactly.
And that is a big distinction and an important fact in how we develop the regulations and the legislation. The legislature followed that mandate, and it is all geared toward medicine. It's geared toward medical marijuana, and I hope that path continues.
So you're comfortable at where we are right now in the process?
I'm comfortable, but I know, like for example, I said that these should be granted the first quarter of next year, but there's lawsuits have been filed. There could be an injunction that slows it up. So people have to understand whenever this is a lot's at stake. There's a lot of interested parties, and this is the first time we've done this. So if we stay on the current path, I think we'll get her done first quarter of next year.
Well, we knew guns were going to come up. We knew marijuana would come up, and you knew football would come up. And here we are. A couple of questions. You have come out publicly now and said you think the University of Arkansas should continue to have a presence in Little Rock. Is that correct?
Oh, I do. Let me back up just for a second, though. War Memorial Stadium. This is an example of where I made the call that War Memorial Stadium, instead of being a standalone agency out there with little support and draining general revenues, ought to be put into parks and tourism to have more support, and also they ought to be financially independent without draining general revenues. And I think since it's been brought into parks and tourism, it's been a real success. They have more support. They've made some improvements in the stadium. They've had some great concerts there. And so I see the next logical step is a continuation of football there. And I hope that Arkansas State University plays there. I hope that the Razorbacks play there. And they don't have to play each other, I might add.
Well, I'm going to get to that. I was going to start, though, should the Razorbacks continue a presence there.
And I've had conversations with a number of people at the University of Arkansas, and I'm an alumni there.
Right.
And I'm from Northwest Arkansas, but I see it as important to the University of Arkansas in terms of their statewide presence, their recruiting capability, in terms of their program, to have a continued presence in Central Arkansas. And I'd like to see it an SEC game at least once every other year.
And specific question from a caller. Do you think Arkansas and Arkansas State should play each other in football every year?
There's a lot of things the governor ought to be involved in. and I'm not sure that's one of them. But so I'll leave that to the different universities. I actually saw where you might have made a prediction that it could happen in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
We'll see, but I think they're both two very strong programs. Obviously, the University of Arkansas has a longer and richer history, but Arkansas State is really a rising power as well. So we'll see what the schools determine down the road. But I just want to have both schools have some presence here in Central Arkansas at least once a year.
And let's make it clear, you're a fan of both teams. You attend games in both Jonesboro and Fayetteville and Little Rock. Yeah,
I do.
All right, question from Jefferson County. What are we doing to try to provide better pay and benefit for state employees? I know we live in an era of tight budgets right now. Where do you see that going?
Well, we do, and you know, State Employees Association
are answering our phone tonight.
Helping us with this and sponsoring this. You know, our state employees work very, very hard. I'm very proud of them. They have stepped up to the plate, and every time I've asked them to. And so we realized some inequities in the state pay plan early on, and I challenged our Office of Personnel Management to come up with a more fair pay plan. I knew we'd have to invest in it, and so we presented a new pay plan to the legislature that was designed to help us to recruit and retain our state employees, to give those who have specialized capability like IT, you know, a better pay rate. And so we've done that, and that passed, and so they all got a pay bump last year, some not as much as others. But in Jefferson County, it was really important for the recruitment of our Department of Corrections workers. We have a large amount of turnover there. They do very tough work, and so they got a boost, and hopefully that will help us in the retention of some of our Department of Corrections officers.
Let me play off of that, because I had a question on my own sheet, Governor, and that is about our Department of Correction. Our prison system has been in the news a lot lately, and a lot of it has not been good news. Do we have a crisis in our prison system right now?
I'm paying attention to it. It is a concern anytime that you see inmates attack each other, but also whenever they attack guards. And I visited with one of our correction officers in the hospital after being attacked with a family. And this is unacceptable, and I've asked for some reports on it. And one of the problems I've learned is K2. And I'm former head of the DA, and I think about drugs. Surely you can stop drugs being smuggled in. But K2 is something that can be absorbed on an envelope that is presented with prison mail. And so they've actually had to go to the extra length of copying the paper on the inmate mail, so that in case there's K2 on the envelope. So they're going to extra measures, but then if the K2 gets through, then it actually has led to death in certain circumstances, because it's unpredictable amounts, and it could be cut with some very dangerous chemicals. And so then you have other access that actually, it could be drones. And believe it or not, you know, whenever you're working the field or somewhere, there's opportunities for contraband to come in that fashion. So there's some unique challenges that has not been present before. I know Wendy Kelly and the officials there are working hard to address it, but I'm watching it very carefully, because we want to have prisons that are safe, both for inmates and everyone that's there. Let
me just ask you straight out, do you have confidence in the management team you have in place at the Department of Correction right now?
Wendy Kelly has been a terrific team player. She's taken on some very tough responsibilities through the death penalty situation that we had in Arkansas, but also in terms of managing the prison. I have confidence in her. It's a very challenging environment. We're watching the amount of space that we have. One of the solutions she came up with was to build some additional isolation cells, because if you have a prisoner that is acting badly, that's the recourse for it. We have a challenge with gangs in prison, and we're have to take steps to address that and make sure that they're in different units, or it makes it more difficult for them to organize and carry out their activities. Another thing we need is prosecution of the people that carry out these things. And you know, sometimes the reluctance of prosecutors to go after an inmate on an inmate assault. You've got to do that, and you've got to add time to it if they carry out that. So we're addressing it, but we're going to watch it very carefully.
State budgets are always a juggling act, but are these things going to require additional funds for the Department of Correction?
Well, we've already invested $50 million additional dollars in my first 2 years for additional prison space. We've made some adjustments in terms of our population and moving them out of our county jails to reduce that back up. We had it, I think we have it somewhat under control in terms of the growth, but even under normal growth, it'll be just a matter of years before we have to have additional space again. So it's something we're keeping an eye on, and we'll have to come back to. People talk about, well, why can't we cut the cost of government? Well, because we haven't cut the cost of crime yet. And we're still educating children, and we still have health care needs. So that's a challenge, but prisons is something that public safety is the most important responsibility I have, and we want to make sure we get it right.
Question from Saline County. Speaking of budgets, my personal experience in decades of watching state government is that what is now the Arkansas Department of Transportation, formerly the Highway and Transportation Department, has always had an insatiable appetite. Now that's not to say that's not warranted, but there's always, we're told, needs of hundreds of millions of dollars of additional highway funds. You have spoken out on that issue in recent months. Where do you see us going with the highway program?
Well, I see us having to do an additional highway funding program in the future. If you look back, our first challenge was meeting the federal match. There was $200 million of federal highway funds available. We had to match it with $50 million. And so we had the highway improvement plan last year that did come up with the money for that. Part of it was general revenues for the first time in history. We have an ongoing funding stream. Part of it was using our surplus to meet it. So we met that. But there's a general consensus, and this is both by the Highway Department, but it's also by the Bureau of Legislative Research that looked at it independently, and as well as my task force that I created. And all three looked at it and said there needs to be about $400 million more of annual funds in order to properly maintain and to build the infrastructure that we need in our state. So it's a fairly consistent amount that everyone says that is needed in the future. It doesn't have to be done at one point, at one time, and so I see this to be a big issue in the 2019 general session to look at an additional highway plan and how we can come up with additional revenues to maintain our highways. And the biggest need is really in the farm to market roads.
Right.
They need to be rebuilt. They need to have an overlay program. It's just going to take money to get that done.
And the money's going to come from?
Well, it's not going to come from general revenues. We allocated.
You made that clear. Yeah.
We allocated a small portion of general revenues toward highways for the first time in history, but we cannot hurt education. We cannot impede the other needs of our states. There cannot be this gargantuan amount that comes out of general revenues and flows into highways. And that is sometimes the easiest solution for the legislature and everyone to look at and say, well, let's just take the sales tax on tires and used cars and new cars because they're automobiles and put that toward roads. That's too big of a chunk out of general revenues. And so there's got to be, in my judgment, additional revenues that can handle that. I think it needs a long discussion as to what that is, and anything that involves any type of a tax or a fee increase needs to go to the voters for approval.
Speaking of the budget, for years, one of the fastest growing areas of the state budget has been increased Medicaid spending. That has not slowed at all. Arkansas did become somewhat of a model with private option. There's so many issues coming, but we've had failed Republican attempts to repeal so-called Obamacare. So first of all, where do you see things going from this point forward in Washington on that standpoint? And then let's bring it down to Arkansas, and how do we respond here in Arkansas?
Well, in the national perspective and debate, I supported Graham Cassidy bill, which repealed and replaced the Affordable Care Act. It gave us everything I wanted, which was more flexibility for the states. It gave us a sufficient funding stream, and it also repealed the individual mandate. So it did what I wanted, and I supported Graham Cassidy. Now, it didn't pass. The question is, will they come back to it? I think it's going to be hard. But I talked to the Vice President recently, and he's committed, and they'd like to be able to bring that back next year. So we'll see about that. But in the meantime, we have to have more flexibility at the state level to manage the health care in our state. And so we're asking for that in terms of the Medicaid budget, which is what's really costing us our state dollars. I've got a waiver request from the Trump administration, and I'll be going again and pushing them for it next week, and actually tomorrow.
Oh, you're headed to Washington tomorrow?
I'm going to Washington tomorrow.
Gotcha.
And so I'm going to be making my case again for those waivers, and hopefully we'll be successful.
While we're in the area of DHS, I've had several questions on mental health initiatives. This one from Jefferson County, from people in essence saying, when are the citizens going to be educated, notified of changes that are going on in the mental health system? Are we slow in doing that? We've had several questions along those lines.
Well, let me, I'm not sure exactly the context in which it's asked, but in terms of mental health, we recognize there's a problem with we have those with mental health challenges that are on our streets, and sometimes they commit a crime. Sometimes they are confronted by law enforcement. And we're training our police officers to identify those with a mental health problem. So we don't just put them all in our county jails and load up our jails and prisons with those that really have a mental health problem. And so we have created 4 actually crisis stabilization units where those with a mental health problem can be diverted instead of jail to a crisis center where they can get the treatment that they need, whether it's medication, whether it's other needs, and they can be stabilized there over a period of 30 days. And that's might be what she's referencing. There's 4 pilot programs that were started. I've put the funding toward it. The local communities are now developing the plans to implement that.
Gotcha.
And they're proceeding.
Yeah, the exact wording on this other question, the new system is already being put in place and many are unaware of changes, is what the caller said.
Yeah, and it's an exciting opportunity that will cover much of the state. We want it to be a success, and hopefully we can expand that to the remainder of the state. But it's really innovative. It is an investment addressing a challenge that plagues every state and every community, but we've got to be able to provide those mental health resources.
15 years ago this month, Governor, I remember exactly where I was. I was actually at the governor's mansion in a meeting, but our state Supreme Court declared our system of funding public education unconstitutional, the Lakeview case. We've put a lot of new money those last 15 years into K through 12 public education. Are you pretty pleased with where we are with the state of K-12? And I'll get on to higher education after that. But right now, I know you've had some new emphasis, such as the computer coding in the public schools.
Well, I mean, obviously we have a long ways to go, but I believe the foundation is there. I believe Commissioner Key's doing a great job with all of the educators on the professional side. We just submitted our new ESSA plan, which is where Washington has given the states more flexibility. You know, under the previous program, there was very stringent requirements. We have more flexibility in order to measure accountability and success of our students. We submitted our plan, and one foundation said we're in the top 7 in the country. in terms of the quality of the plan that was submitted. In Arkansas, our reading initiative, the RISE initiative that I've supported and helped to implement, is a strong reading program trying to get students at third grade level to read at third grade level. Because if you just pass them on without that reading capability, then they're not going to be able to succeed in the other core subjects and they're going to fall behind. So that's a core emphasis that we have. In terms of the funding, I think we're funding education at the right level. You look at other states like Oklahoma that's had to cut back.
Right.
Even on the days of school, their budget has been constrained. So we have maintained our commitment to education and the adequacy requirements. Even on the facility side, and that's where I sent a message that we've got to be a little more careful because we can't afford $100 million every 2 years for facilities from a state perspective. But I hope we can get a control over that large amount of expenditures, but at the same time provide the kind of facilities and safe and dry facilities that are needed.
As I mentioned, we've put hundreds of millions of new dollars into K through 12 over the past 15 years. A lot of that court mandated before you were governor. In the process, though, have we maybe ignored higher education a little too much? Have we underfunded our institutions of higher education in the state?
They would probably say so.
That's their job, right?
You know, if you look across the country, there's been a shift in higher education from over-reliance upon state funding to a broader range of funding sources, from private sector to raising the funds to revenue streams from innovation and intellectual property. In Arkansas, you know, we have not cut back on higher ed, and that was a commitment I made as governor, is that we maintained that same level of funding. There was not any increase, but we did not cut higher ed, which is almost a victory. Now,
exactly. Again, compared certainly to Oklahoma, you mentioned Louisiana, a number of our surrounding states.
Correct. But in this last session, though, we put $10 million more in new funding in higher education, which is the first time in probably a decade that they've had additional funding. That is contingent upon them meeting the productivity funding goals, and if they do, it's an incentive for them. So there's always more to do, but I've pushed higher education also to watch their budgets, to make sure that they invest in the teachers, but also make sure they don't get overburdened with administrative overhead.
I want to move back just real quickly. We've had some questions back to K through 12, and that is that the school district in our state's largest city, the Little Rock School District, continues to be under state control. Do you see light at the end of that tunnel in respect to getting back to the point where we can have an elected school board in Little Rock?
That's our goal. You know, certainly Commissioner Key, Michael Poore, wants to see the students succeed and to reach academic performance, and that's the measuring stick, and we're anxious for that to go back to local control. But this is not just I mean, it's a responsibility on the state under the same Lakeview case that you were talking about, Rex. This is a state responsibility to make sure every child in this state has access to an adequate education. And it was clear in 6 schools, a small portion of the schools in Little Rock, that they were not meeting academic performance, and that prior to me, actually the board, after I got elected, one of the first things they did was to take that over. And so the improvements have been made. I think a lot of progress has been made, both in terms of facilities, but also in terms of the academic performance. We're anxious for the other schools to be brought up to the right level.
Got a question out of Lincoln County, and we'll move back onto the national stage real quickly. Do you support the tax reform bill that came out of the House last week? And if so, how do you think that will help Arkansans?
Well, there's a difference between the House and the Senate version. I support both of those being reconciled. I do support a compromise bill that accomplishes tax reform at the federal level. Now, under both versions, we do away with our state and local income tax deduction, and that's generally been the concern of Arkansans. 80% of Arkansas income tax filers do not itemize, and so eliminating that deduction doesn't hurt us as much as it does in some states. And so if you, with 80% of the filers not itemizing, and with you increasing the standard deduction, that benefits Arkansans. And so I see it as a net plus for Arkansas. I support those measures of tax reform. And then the lowering of the corporate income tax should be an economic boost to our entire country, including this state. Corporations investing more of their dollars rather than shipping it overseas or hiding it somewhere because you got a lower tax rate. And so we've had a long period of sustained economic growth. I think this kind of tax reform will help us to continue that momentum.
If you're reelected, what kind of additional tax reform would you like to do at the state level?
Well, I won't give you an amount, but my goal has always been to get the income tax rate down. That's been my almost singular focus in terms of tax reform, is reducing the individual income tax rate so that we can be more competitive with our surrounding states. It's going to take some while to do it. We have reduced the rate for about really a majority of Arkansans. Whenever we lowered it for the middle class and the lower income, we've got to be able to flatten that rate for all Arkansans, and that's the next objective that I would have.
And do you replace that revenue, or can we live with less revenue as a state?
Well,
the lost revenue.
The first thing you look at is our growth revenue, and so we absorbed $150 million in income tax cuts through our growth. And so, I measure very carefully. We did 100 million first, right, and then the next swipe at it was 50 million because I didn't want to get too big of a chunk out there. And so, whatever we do next, we will look at first absorbing it through our growth revenue in the state, which we can handle some of that. And then I'm looking at the legislative task force that's working very hard, looking at whether there needs to be exemptions that are closed out, if there's other means of accelerating the tax reductions in this state. So I'm looking at both growth revenue, but also looking at the recommendation that might come out of the legislature.
Gotcha. Governor, we have continued federal investigations going on as it relates to the legislative use of the so-called General Improvement Fund. I don't think that's a secret to anybody. Is the GIF as it existed dead, in your opinion, going forward?
It is dead in terms of practice. Because, as you know, this last session, we did not allow for any legislative GIF. That was my call, but it was also the call of the legislative leadership. It had been abused before, although many times it's been properly used. It was abused. And also it was questionable in terms of the Arkansas Supreme Court decisions as being special allocations and special legislation versus for a general purpose. And so we ended as a practice GIF. I believe it is important to end it in terms of legislative enactment, to make it clear to the voters that this is not going to be our practice in the future, not just in my administration, but in future administrations as well. There is always a need that's out there for our rural communities and accessing some special capital. It could be for many different needs, but there's means to do that consistent with our constitutional principles. You appropriate the money to rural services.
I was going to say, you've got a rural services department, right, to do that?
Absolutely, and they take applications for grants from our rural communities, and they make a determined decision based upon merit and need and the criteria that's set out. That's the right way to do it. And so we can continue to refine that, but we need to end that legislative GIF that has been abused in the past.
Of course, that typically has come from surplus funds. Since you've become governor, we've been lucky, certainly as a country. We've had growth every quarter since you've become governor. Every student of history knows that is not going to last forever. Do we have a large enough rainy day fund? Should we do more along those lines in the state of Arkansas?
Yes, we should. Whenever you look at 2 years between legislative sessions, 1 year between the fiscal session and the next session, that's a long time for the governor to manage the state budget and the emergency needs that pop up from flooding issues to tornadoes, but it's also could be Alita has capital improvements. That's our law enforcement training academy. Or it could be other capital needs that pop up in an emergency fashion. It could have been, which it was, our child welfare program needed additional funds so that we could have enough caseworkers to manage the children in foster care. So those are the type of rainy day funds that are necessary, and we need to increase that amount for the future. I would add that we have, the last session, we put in $100 million into a long-term reserve fund that is much more difficult to access. It is intended for truly those economic downturns that could be unpredictable. So we are trying to address that both in rainy day funds and long-term reserve funds.
We started the hour talking about your trip to China, economic development in South Arkansas. In East Arkansas, we've had a lot of questions, by the way, from South Arkansas and East Arkansas tonight. Let me ask you, does your head of the Arkansas Industrial Development Commission, Mike Preston, does he have all of the tools that you think he needs right now and you need, things like money in quick closing funds, things of that sort, or do we need legislative action to do more in that area?
I think we're good in our incentives. You know, we did away with one. We supplemented with something that was more effective. You know, all of our incentives are performance-based in terms of how many jobs are going to be created, and so we measure that very carefully. We also have what you call the Quick Action Closing Fund, which is really for infrastructure improvements at the beginning of a project that will help get them over the edge and say we can invest in Arkansas even though we have to make some infrastructure improvements. So the key for the future, though, is that you know, there's one element that says we don't need to be competing with other states in economic development incentives. Florida actually cut out most of their incentive programs.
Where you hired Mike Preston from Florida.
Exactly. Yeah. And but it's very essential that we continue to be able to compete because you could look at you know, a company in Jonesboro that they call up and say we could lose 100 and some jobs there in Jonesboro and lose them to Virginia or Georgia. We had to compete for those jobs. We won, and they expanded there. We're competing for jobs in Northwest Arkansas, even with Oklahoma. So we have to have those programs in place because I want to see us grow our economy, and you got to compete to do it to be able to win.
We recently missed the cut on one. Are we ever going to see an automobile assembly plant in the state of Arkansas?
Give us time, give us time. You know, we did, and you learn how big of projects those are. When you're talking about 4,000 workers, when you're at a 3.5 or 3.6 unemployment rate, where do you get those workers? And so there's a lot more that we can do to prepare ourselves for one of those OEMs, those automobile manufacturers, because we're growing, and one of them is continue to grow the pipeline. And with Hino Motors in West Memphis, Marion area, with a lot of the parts suppliers that we're creating in Arkansas, it becomes logical for Arkansas to be the next location for OEM.
With Walmart headquartered here, do you think there is still potential as they focus more on American-made products to get those manufacturers near that home office in Bentonville? Is there something we can mine there that maybe we're not doing everything we can?
Yes, I think we can continue to do that. We market the fact that Walmart is here and they're emphasizing returning manufacturing in the United States. I was in Fort Smith on Monday at Pradco.
Lures.
Yeah.
Fishing lures.
Lures, and they're able to expand and increase jobs there at Pradco because of the contract they have with Walmart. And so Walmart could have sent that overseas, but they chose to do it in the United States, and Pradco won that. So that is already working, and that was one example of it, though the Pradco expansion that resulted from increased business with Walmart.
We've been at our near record low unemployment rates in recent months. Do we have an adequately trained workforce in Arkansas to fill the kind of jobs that you're going to China and all over the world to try to attract? You have to ask that question.
We have to increase our workforce training and moving people into the workforce. So we're at about as low as we're going to get in terms of unemployment rate. So people who want to work or trained to work are out there working. What we've got to do now is to move people from not being properly trained, getting them the training, to moving them back in the workforce so that our labor participation rate increases. It's something that's a national problem, but that's something we really need to work on. That'll be a big focus of the next year for me.
I figured as much. Governor, it's Thanksgiving week. We're entering the last minute of the show here. What are you most thankful for as we go into another Thanksgiving?
I'm thankful for the people of Arkansas. Whenever you see their heart and their compassion, their generosity, it's just inspiring. And let's keep that generous spirit through the Thanksgiving holiday. And if I have any prayer, it'd be that we remind ourselves constantly that we need to be civil in our discourse, both in the public arena and the private arena.
And a really important question, Governor, with Thanksgiving week here. I think I know the answer to this. Do the Razorbacks end that losing streak and beat Missouri on Friday afternoon?
Go Hogs, beat Missouri.
I think so. And we've got to mention some of our other teams. Arkansas State having a great year. UCA wins its conference. We're on the UCA campus, and they're now in the national playoffs.
It's going to be fun to watch both ASU, UCA, and the other teams. But I was at an ASU game down in Dallas, so I'm cheering them on.
Have a great Thanksgiving, Governor. Thank you. Appreciate you being with us.
Arkansans Ask Governor Asa Hutchinson is underwritten by the Arkansas State Employees Association, Incorporated, an organization of state employees working toward the betterment of state government.